Yeah, welcome to podcast number 4 with Sanjukta, Mehek, and Arvind. How are you, all of three of you doing?
Well, I'm doing great. Thanks for having us again, Manhar. How's everyone? Hey, Mehak, how's your new job coming along?
It's coming around pretty well. I wish there was a work from home option. It's a little funny how that doesn't really happen anymore. But yeah, otherwise it's great.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Arvind is joining from cold Chicago. I'm assuming it's very cold now. Arvind?
Uh, I think we lost Arvind in the cold blizzard of Chicago, and I'll give him a minute to come back. But Meg, you made a really interesting point about saying that you don't have work from home privileges, especially given the public sector, where we all talk about efficiency and productivity, and somehow making a commute to work for 2 hours doesn't really it doesn't seem like it has a huge impact on productivity and definitely lowers efficiency.
Absolutely. I mean, I end up spending more than an hour to travel, which honestly can be utilized in many different ways. So yeah, I think it is quite funny, right? Especially considering that there is a little bit of work that I'm doing on climate change. So yeah, I mean, you could save so much time and fuel.
Ye- yep.
Yeah,
Hey
Okay.
Arvind.
guys.
Yeah, how are you from Chicago?
Hi Manhar and hi Sanjukta and Mehek. I'm good, thank you. Chicago winter, luckily, I think is a little bit milder because of the El Nino this year,
Okay.
but probably next year is going to be comparatively a lot more colder. But thank you for asking. How are you guys doing? Good.
We're doing good. Actually, thankfully you joined you. I just wanted to ask you, can you do a quick recap of what we did last in our last podcast? So
Yeah.
all of us are like up to speed.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm glad that we were able to do 4 podcasts with Manhar, and thank you, Manhar, for this opportunity. We
Pleasure.
really started this whole series with the idea that rigorous monitoring and evaluation can be done by nonprofits at all levels of scale, small, medium, and large. We did say that smaller organizations have small and medium scale organizations don't have the in-house expertise and capacity to do what like large ones do. So then the question was, what can we actually do to make sure that systematically these organizations can also do good monitoring and evaluation? And in the process, we kind of discussed how the approach of systems thinking ahead of doing the theory of change or LFA in the typical nonprofit workflow can actually help organizations identify the important processes and then lead to a monitoring and evaluation system based on that. And I think we've done a pretty good job of hopefully establishing the case as to why this is important and why different organizations face these issues and how the systems mapping can be, the systems approaches generally can be helpful in this case, or basically help with the TOC LFA. And in this podcast, I hope we will get a little bit more into the details of why the enhancing TOC LFA with the systems mapping, system-based approaches will be helpful for organizations, and what does it mean for uh, in the larger sense for the ecosystem of development sector as well.
Yeah, thanks for the recap. I want to double back to what we were just talking with Mehak before when you were having mic issue about productivity and efficiency, something the development sector is really, really trying, but really doesn't follow in their regular day-to-day work. Because I don't work in the development sector, but I have work from home. And our office is so tiny, they're not even spending on infrastructure so that people actually make an effort to show up. Surprisingly, in India, where the development sector has resource constraint all the time, they're still forcing people to come to work, spending all that money on infrastructure and all that, and not using that resources to fund maybe if other programs
Hmm.
and stuff.
Yeah.
And I know, I mean, that keep bringing you back to the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. You had such a big program with so much of traction, really got the whole country moved. There were movies made on it and everything, and just makes me realize that I want to ask Manhar. I'm sure you have read about it. Do you feel in like one word, it was a success or it was a failure?
Well, I will use three words, Sanjukta, and that is I don't
Okay.
know, because I don't have, you know, evidence to be able to prove it one way or the other. So, like someone from like, sitting outside, I actually don't know about it, whether it has been a success or whether it has been a failure. But having said that, from what hear in the media, and this is purely like from what hear in the media, it seems to be a success. But still, there is no, I mean, proof to be able to, prove how successful it has been, right? And whether if it has been successful, how people's life, has been transformed, right? That
That's
also is a gray area as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. The fact that you said you don't know, because there was not a measure, like a tangible measure of success, that the way we can say, okay, this is how we measure, like we say in education, that kids' test scores improved, hence they are smarter than they were before they started with the program. In this case, we don't know. We know the government did spend a huge amount of money on building toilets. It was the media, it really did capture a lot of it. There were movies made on it. uh Artists like actors and celebrities came on the street with the broom, cleaning up
Yeah.
really clean streets, but they're still trying to show that why it's important.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings that one word, that why, how do we know it actually worked? Just because we built toilets or work done, people were still going outside, they were still defecating outside. The amount of money that they spend in building a toilet in everybody's home, people started using this as a spare room, as a workshop, as a, I don't know, storage space. So we have good, like this is like an example of an unplanned spending with the right intention. Sometimes even with the best of intention, we may not get the impact we want, because I mean, I think Mehek would be a good person to comment on this, because social change is really hard.
Yeah.
And even if you equip yourself with the right tools, you may sometime not be as successful as you want it to. Like, you'll assume that with the amount of money and everything that was spent, we would be a very clean country right now. Everybody would be using toilets, there would be no garbage on the street and all, but it's not like that. Even in big cities, they haven't really been able to come up with that progress. So, but like we say, even if you, when you have the right tool, even then we have issues. But not having the right tools, I guess that's another different set of challenges. And I'm gonna actually gonna ask Arvind to shed some light on this, because he's been working with some organizations on helping them build the right tools and working with them closely. Can you talk a little bit about the tools that you have been working on and your experience with them?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I have been working with a couple of organizations that basically had the issue of not having a consistent theory of change or a logical framework over time. And because in nonprofit sector, you have so much turnover, right? So one team develops all of these frameworks and they leave in, a few years time, and the new one comes in and they're not sure why these frameworks were put together the way they were put together. So that is challenge number one. And challenge number two is a lot of organizations think they want to measure something, but what they end up measuring is not really relevant for the impact they want to achieve. And thirdly, you constantly have this issue between nonprofits and funders where funders want outcome metrics that show visible change, but nonprofits are unable to convince the funders that the metrics that really matter happen in the long term. And in the short term, we may or may not be able to prove that the long-term outcome will happen because of what we're doing right now. But what is interesting in all of this is that there is a common underlying issue, which is that people in the process of establishing these projects and organizational, multiple project organizations, being unable to kind of systematically say that this is how the processes are actually happening in reality in terms of the mechanisms. And out of these understood mechanisms, we are going to create a theory of change or LFA. There is a disconnect between what mechanisms we are actually working on versus what actually gets represented on TOC and LFA, etc. It's not to say that TOC and LFA are bad tools, but I think right now we are treating them as step one, but ideally they should be step two. The work I am doing right now is basically to replace something else in step one, and that is doing a systems mapping approach, but more specifically a participatory systems mapping approach. Because as you very well know, a lot of times different stakeholders in the organization or on the projects, including external stakeholders, may not have the same consensus with you on how you think that the theory of change is working. So what I have been doing is sitting with different teams, understanding their different the mechanisms that they are in charge of or they work with, and then putting together these small subsystems within the projects, within the organizations, into a larger system that clearly explains how different stakeholders are interacting, what are the nature of interaction, what are the inputs and outputs of these interactions. And out of all this representation comes a very clear picture on what can be measured in the short term and what can be measured in the long term, and what things, if we measure now, will kind of give us confidence that the long-term impact will eventually happen. So it basically then leads to the first point we spoke about, where we are establishing a monitoring and evaluation framework that is theory driven, that comes out of a consensus of participatory approach from everyone, and therefore becomes a live and dynamic document that can evolve over time. Your theory of change can evolve over time, and everything else can evolve over time. But the step one of systems mapping or the process mapping, actor mapping, everything falls under systems mapping, basically ensures that there is institutional history and memory of how these changes have happened and how they are related to the ongoing, solutions to dynamic challenges that nonprofits face in the process of implementing their projects. And that's the kind of work I'm doing with a couple of organizations right now, Sanjukta.
That sounds interesting. I know we talked about this even before. But I know you mentioned a lot of these actor mapping and issue mapping and a lot of these tools that already there, but it's kind of like that comes since I'm not really a person who's actively involved in the development sector anymore as much as both of you are. It's interesting to talk about what are the different tools that we should be thinking about during the phase of lifetime of a project. Like what are the first at the initial stage, what are the tools that are available at the middle stage and then at the final stage. I know Mehek is doing this pretty much greater part of her adult life, and you have good examples on what you have used and what you think should have been used. So
Yeah, I mean, I'll give it a shot, honestly. See, if I was to sort of break down that entire chain and I was to think about the tools, very honestly, I'm also very confused in terms of exactly what are the number of tools that exist. I'll tell you some of the common ones that sort of are present. So if I start with, say, an idea, I have an idea that, okay, maybe I want to do a program with women on, say, digital literacy. Then the first thing I would do is probably going to be some kind of a need assessment, some kind of an actor mapping, some kind of an issue mapping. I'll probably do a baseline survey or a scoping study. These would be some of the tools I would use to actually understand what is the level of problem that actually exists in a particular region. I'll probably do a little bit of a literature review also to see, okay, what is the existing theory that surrounds, say, digital literacy among women. Once I have some analysis, some understanding on, okay, what exactly is going on, then I'll sort of go into a space where I'm going to create something that Arvind's been talking about, which is the theory of change, which is essentially just a way to articulate why a change is happening and how the change will happen. And that's when you break down a lot of your outcomes into smaller outcomes and you break down your actions in a sequential manner. Once that has been clarified, you kind of start leveraging something called a logic framework analysis, whereby you actually break down your actions, which are also known as activities. You say, okay, what are these actions going to lead to, which is essentially what your outputs are. And then you'll say that, okay, if these particular outputs are achieved, so say, for example, I've done a workshop, what will be the outcome or what will be the behavior change I'll see in people is what the third or the last angle of it is, which is the outcome. once you have gotten your LFA done, then the next set of tools that you look at are very sort of standard, which are not specifically according to a particular industry, right? You look at your project planning documents, you would have a lot of monitoring sheets, you would regularly collect surveys to understand what really is going on. You'll conduct your activities, so you'll probably have scripts that are there or training modules that are there. Once all of that is done, your program is sort of done, that's when your evaluation part sort of comes in, where you would
Yeah, so
do
my,
something.
I have a
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, query here because there are so many parties involved, here in the project. So there is, I'm assuming there is some room for asymmetric information where one party, has more information, to the problem than the other party, and that sort of.
Yeah, that happens fairly often. I mean, organizations that have very robust communication methods, where they're using tools around communication to whether it's a newsletter or a review document, they are maybe not as they don't probably face that challenge that much. But a lot of times, yes, there is asymmetric information uh, that does sort of come in. I would love actually for Arvind to maybe step in right now and explain this a little bit more.
So thanks, Mehek. And to the point of Manhar on information asymmetry, right? I think that's a very relevant point because a lot of times when multiple stakeholders are involved in the same project or across projects within the same organization, there is going to be information asymmetry. So I think the challenge for any organization is to ensure that that is not the case. They do try their best. Exercises for making a theory of change, like Mehek described, usually happens with the team, etc. But we still have an issue. So I think the thing to understand over here, therefore, is to think about what does it mean for stakeholders to participate in this process to reduce information asymmetry. And I think the part where participation needs to happen is in terms of getting the consensus on how the overall mechanisms for each step of the process works, which is what the system mapping and the approaches, systems thinking basically in a participatory sense makes you do, in opposition to sitting with a team and doing the TOC LFA process, which is still participatory. But since the focus is not on the underlying mechanisms, I think there is an information asymmetry that starts to build over there, which kind of slowly compounds and snowballs into much bigger as the project gets older and larger.
So for example,
that,
Arvind, I would assume that then this leads to what is called micromanaging. So then you want to
Mhm.
micromanage, some aspect of the project, right? That then, leads to.
Exactly. So a lot of the times micromanaging by project leaders or the organizational leaders happen based on the assumption, not that, I am more powerful than the other person, but it mostly happens because of the feeling that I know more than the other person, simply because the information asymmetry is just happening without anybody's, conscious action. So then what then happens is like, it's a cost benefit analysis, right? Do I take the time to then inform everybody of everything? Or do I just take the responsibility of managing the task so that I just tell people what to do and they end up doing it and life is good for everyone? So I think this is the well-intentioned but still bad consequences of micromanaging that happens in nonprofits from an information asymmetry point of view.
I'm gonna let me divert a little bit from this conversation. And micromanaging and all this comes up more of an organizational issues, and it's kind of it's not really a general problem faced in the development sector or across running a program. It's a very organizational thing. It's kind of seen across multiple sectors, not just a very development sector problem. We see it in corporate, we see it in school management, we see it in pretty much every kind of sector. But when you list down all these tools, that it's like assuming that we don't have the micromanagement issue, we don't have the asymmetric issue, we have all these tools and people are aware of them. My question comes, do we want to use all of these tools or do we need to use all of these tools? My perception is that I have read it. It's again my perception on reading it that they're not perfect substitutes or complements. They kind
Yeah.
of need to be used in a smart way, like you find your combination which works best for your situation.
Yeah,
My
Sanjukta, I
what,
completely
right?
agree with that. I mean, I claim that I've been doing this for a decade, but honestly, it is very confusing. One, to figure out, okay, what tool do you actually use? Because you'll have different types of projects. There'll be some that are only 3, 4 months. There'll be some that are across the entire Indian subcontinent. So the scale and everything is very, very different for each project. So how do you utilize, which tool do you utilize, when to sort of combine them? It's a very confusing space. And while there is a lot of literature, I don't think there's enough courses or anything that exist which can really help someone, sort of really bring in clarity to saying that, okay, in such a situation, ideally you should be doing this.
Yeah. So
Yeah, you're right.
I have one, question as an outsider. So which tool is more of a complement and which tool is more of a, substitute? So how do you, assess, that? Is there any,
Actually, that's a good
well,
question. My what reading up on this and what my practical experience have been that a lot of these tools can serve as both substitutes or complements, really depending on what your situation is. What the question about how do we know which ones to use, how do we know which ones to use as substitutes or complements given a situation, that is the kind of technical knowledge which is missing in the sector right now. I mean, there is a lot of discussions on individually the pros and cons of each of these tools and training materials. I mean, you'll find so much online on how to get trained in on developing a theory of change. And there are some certified courses, both given by Indian organizations as well as some foreign organizations. Then there are websites which will help you build an LFA, a system tools, a mapping framework. But what's missing is that, that a global picture where you know about all of these tools, you know the pros and cons of each tools, and you can just put them in that building block. That is what the current sector or the knowledge is that's missing. Like a combination of all these put together.
well,
So you are familiar with, or you may not have intimate knowledge of each and every tool, but you know them enough to know, do you want to spend more time learning about that tool for this program or not? I mean,
yeah,
that's like how we study in our master's program, like in an economics theory program. You'd learn all these methods of doing analysis, but you may not know everything very intimately till you have to use them. But okay, fine. For this method, for doing analysis like this, I will probably need a regression. So you can go and read about them.
yeah.
Here,
So I
what the
think, Sanjukta,
yeah,
because Mehek and Arvind, have been practitioners, Mehek in particular. So I will ask Arvind to step in now, and then, we can get to Mehek as to how do you figure out, which tools are substitutes or complements, you know? Yeah, Arvind.
To just build on what Sanjukta was already, clearly laying out, right? So I think there is this thing about building capacity in nonprofits. That's a point of contention between the nonprofits and the funders, right? So everybody agrees that we have to build the capacity of organizations in the development sector. But the challenge is to define what the capacity is, what capacity we're talking about, and how do we go about building it, right? And what Sanjukta and like explained well, and Mehak also pointed out very nicely, is that in this particular case, it's kind of easy to say, one way of actually saying that this is the capacity we want to build in non-profit professionals at the least, is this capacity to know all these tools, understand the advantages and disadvantages of all these tools, and then knowing which tool is applicable in which part of the project. For example, everybody talks about systems thinking in development sector. It's a buzzword, right? In the last few years, especially with the climate change and everything, people are talking about systems resilience, adaptive system, flexible system. It's all over the place. In all the reports, you can find it, be it United Nations or anything from even the Indian philanthropic foundations. But the challenge is, how do you build this systems thinking capacity in nonprofits, right? And when you start asking this question, then we realize that even within the systems thinking framework, there are multiple tools.
systems mapping, the one I mentioned earlier in the conversation, is one. There are causal loop diagrams, which is a more simplified version of systems mapping. Then we have something called stock and flow diagram, which helps you to understand what are the resources that you keep in stock and how do they flow to different parts of the project or organization over time. And similarly, you have few other tools. Now, the challenge is you cannot teach people that use this tool in this context like a formula, which is how a lot of the nonprofit training happens right now. There's like a workbook, there are some resources given, learning resources, people go with it. But ideally, what we want to go ahead in terms of the process of building capacity for systems thinking or to resolve the issues we've spoken so far is like a workshop or like a training program where the approach in itself is to help people figure out the full set of tools, but also to understand the nuances of when to use it and when not to use it. And that's basically where like I think we need to focus more of our energy and efforts as the sector level, but also I think at a national level, resources need to be rethought
Yeah.
as a the development sector.
Yeah, so I think I will, ask Mehek to come in now, and also in her, response, if she can, give one or two specific real, examples. So that will, add greatly to the discussion. Yeah, Mehek.
Actually, Mehak,
Um,
before you give an
yeah.
example, I just want to say one thing here. Before that conversation on the need for this training, I want to point out to Mehak, Manhar, that we have been, like the three of us have been working on developing a workshop, which will be which will look at all these tools and would be a lot more, will train train practitioners how to develop use these tools and develop a more systematic approach in running a program. And so hoping that in the next few months we'll be able to run our workshop where after this workshop people will be more familiar with, not just being familiar with the tools, but making that decision, which ones to choose, which ones to leave out, how to use them as a complement, how to use them as a substitute. And maybe in a couple of months, our program would be out there and it would be helpful for a lot of practitioners and organizations to improve their program.
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure it will be, because you know, have the requisite experience, and so it will be more of an experiential, learning, which is, I think, sorely needed. Yeah, so I think examples, if we can talk about one example,
What kind of example are you looking for? Like
like like this one in particular. I think the case of polio is, I think that was one successful campaign, right?
That's true.
Yeah.
Actually, before polio, Mehak, will you want to talk about the UNICEF child marriage program? Because that's kind of happening right now. And it's a really interesting program, or the UNICEF has done a really interesting work to give it a foundation.
Yeah, I think what has been really interesting is the project that I'm working on right now. UNICEF is very sorted in terms of like really thinking through the challenge. They're pretty good with saying that okay, this is how behavior shift needs to happen, and have broken down their entire thing of saying that okay, if this happens, then we will be moving towards ending child marriage. So whether it is thinking about the girl child, whether it is thinking about the boy child, whether it's thinking about the parents, they're very clear about that. But now the twist in the sort of story is the fact that when you actually take what UNICEF already has in terms of their logics and you start applying that onto the ground, you realize that things are very tough when you're trying to implement it. Like an example was that at one point of time we started saying that okay, we're going to do a project here. Very soon we realized that those villages actually um, don't need the intervention. And if we hadn't actually utilized the tools of a need assessment and issue mapping, a stakeholder mapping, we would have actually turned around and done an entire program in an area where it wasn't required. So the entire theory and the outcomes that UNICEF has created would have never come into play. So it's important for us to really think through on, okay, what are the tools that we are utilizing? So even though they have done their research and probably a scoping study, they never did it in the area that was needed to be done. So, it's Hence, like I was saying, that the tools are important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Any
but
other example that you?
it's an interesting program. I mean, given that NSF has the very clean TOC, they have a behavior change already out there, they have the foundation ready. So there are programs you will be running with such a great foundation, then you'll be running some programs where you're just starting from scratch. I guess somebody just have an idea, I want to do this, and that's it. And you're figuring out everything.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to really know what exactly is the outcome that we are looking for, right? Now, for example, if I was to go back to what we were talking in terms of Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the reason why there were all these reports about toilets being utilized as storerooms and having mandirs that were being built inside those storerooms is because probably people never thought through on the mindset shift. So yes, it is important to have a toilet in that area. But if you really want to look at sanitation and you want to look at health, then the first thing you have to attack is the mindset. And if I compare that to, say, something like a polio campaign, there is a big difference in that, right? So, like, it's important for us to sort of really understand what the challenges are by leveraging the tools.
Yeah, I think the polio campaign is a good example. Even Manhar mentioned it a couple of minutes back. I mean, India has been polio free, I think, since 2011. And it was a radical campaign. I mean, they just had a catchy tagline. They got the biggest superstar on every media possible, on radio, on television, on billboards. And that's it. They ensure that it's accessible in every tiny part of the country. And we are polio free, which was a very, very dangerous disease affecting kids. And that's a great example of just doing the right thing and in the right way, using your resources where you need to, focusing on things like cultural change, and understanding the multiple stakeholders you integrated media, you understood the needs of the people, as like did the behavioral change among the people who, like, you are not only understand how dangerous that disease is, but also that it's not that difficult to get access to your polio vaccine. The government ensure it's there, it's available, it went to everyone's home. At one point, they were going to everyone's house to give them that do boon zindagi ke, that catch line. And it got so traction, so popular that we have been successfully able to eradicate polio, which is a very, very big statement to make. For me, I would say, like, one of the best campaigns that the government run, use their resources wisely and achieve the goal that they were looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
there are other good examples as well. Like, I think the AIDS campaign was also a really interesting campaign. Arvind, you have talked about
Arvind
this
can talk
a
about
few
this.
days
Yeah,
back.
Arvind.
Yeah, he was talking about this a few days back. Can you enlighten us a bit?
Yeah. I think the polio example sets a good base because AIDS campaign in India, especially in Tamil Nadu, was also in a very similar vein, wherein they realized that to achieve the health outcomes you want, it is important to take into consideration the mindset change, but more importantly, on sensitive issues, to take into consideration cultural norms and those kind of things also, right? Because in Tamil Nadu, the way the AIDS campaign went was the tagline was Pulli Raja ke AIDS Varma in Tamil, which literally translates to will the dotted king get AIDS? Which was in the dotted king is an euphemism for condoms, right? And condoms is not a word that was casually thrown around in conversations in any part of India, let alone in the South conservative areas, right? But what is really important about both the polio and the AIDS campaign essentially was that the designers were able to understand the full systemic mechanisms in play, starting from cultural norms to mindsets to changes at the policy level. And that is why they were such a big success. And which is also, I think, the missing part in big programs that did not achieve the success that polio and AIDS campaign did. And you can say, and I think the eventual goal of systems thinking, etc., is to ensure that everybody systematically and rigorously is able to develop these nuanced understanding of their projects and phenomena, so that these kind of successful programs are not the exception but more like the norm. And that is very important for a country like us, where the resources are already scarce, be it the government resources or the non-profit development sector resources. And I think that is where all the conversations we have had so far, converge upon that we need to rethink how we look at these issues and how we think about the non-profit workflow as we go into more challenging times in the next few decades.
Yeah. I think Sanjukta now, can.
Actually, I have nothing to wind up. I think Arvind winded up in a really great way, ending on a positive note of how systems thinking and how planning and doing it right can actually give us the right results that we're looking for. And hopefully, if our program will be able to achieve that and help smaller organization achieve what the government could achieve with its infinite access to resources. So let's see what the future holds for us and the development sector.
Yeah, it will be wonderful, because there is a lot of need for this kind of thing in India, because we are, so there's this process of structural transformation, like what is it called, like people are moving out of labor to other sectors, so they need this kind of training. Yeah, so any last words?
I think just thank you for this opportunity, Manhar, and I hope that we've been able to share some of our understandings with the larger audience who listen to your podcast.
No.
And I hope we get to do more work with you in the near future. And thanks for everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Manoj.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you, Sanjukta. Thank you, Arvind. And thank you, Mehek. Yeah.